Hey juniors, I wanted to go ahead and record a short little review presentation on how to construct a strong thesis statement and how to really get the most out of close reading to prepare you for the timed writing that you have coming up. So this is going to address both of those things and hopefully be a little bit of a refresher. This is me talking to you from now knowing you a little bit better as writers because I've read all of your Raisin in the Sun timed writings and I've seen where your strengths and areas for improvement are in terms of close reading and constructing an argument. So let's get into it. So the first thing I'm going to go over with you is a little review on what should go into a strong thesis statement. And the first thing I want you to remember, the biggest thing that you're going to hear me say several times today, is that a strong thesis statement has two things. It has text and opinion. And what I mean by that is text is the specific things in the story that your argument is based on. What elements of the literature are you going to be analyzing today? The opinion is the larger claim or message about what the author is trying to say, to prove, to argue, or to claim. So here's an example from Raisin in the Sun. I took this and kind of cobbled together several good thesis statements that I saw when reading those. Lorraine Hansberry uses the analogy of lines and circles, as well as sharply contrasting tones, to prove that in order to advance in life, one must keep making forward progress, even through trying times. And if you want to know what I'm talking about when I mean text plus opinion, I've highlighted the text in green, and that's the part that says what the author uses. The analogy of lines and circles, as well as sharply contrasting tones, and then the opinion is the yellow part, the larger claim that in order to advance in life, one must keep making forward progress even through trying times. That's got both of those elements. It's got close reading, it's planting the seeds for what close reading you're going to do, what literary elements you're going to analyze, and it's got that larger message that you as a human being reading literature, you can walk away from after reading this play. So try to avoid just hinting at a message or meaning to come. I saw a lot of this in the Raisin in the Sun timed writings, something like this. Lorraine Hansberry uses her characters to deliver her message about prejudice and loss of hope. You're sort of touching on some bigger ideas, but you're really begging a lot of questions if you do that. You basically make your reader, or me, ask these questions. Well, what about these characters? And what message about prejudice or loss of innocence are you going to be proving? All right? So again, always ask yourself these two questions. What larger argument is the author making, and what in the story is going to help me show that argument? Those two things will be in your thesis. That's the text plus opinion. And if you have these two things, if you make sure you have text plus opinion, you sort of use this as a checklist, these two things. If you feel like you've got these two things, you've probably got a pretty decent thesis statement on your hands. You've probably got at least like a B+ thesis statement if you've got text plus opinion. Okay, let's talk about close reading. So in terms of close reading, always keep that iceberg principle we talked about in week number 2 of the school year. This idea that your goal in any literary analysis or close reading is to delve below the surface of the author's text to uncover the author's deeper meaning. There's always something lurking below the surface, right? Just like the metaphor of the iceberg. And this is done by analyzing how and why the author made the choices that they made when they were writing their work. So to get below the surface, go through this basic process. First, find any high leverage or high impact part of the quote. You can do this by going through the quote and sort of highlighting it or circling things that seem really important that like pop off the page to you. Then identify how you're going to analyze it. Is this a metaphor? Is this a really ominous tone? What is it you're going to do with that? And then break down the literary device or tool. Like, what is a metaphor? Why would an author use a metaphor? Why would an author shift a tone in their novel, right? And then make sure you're analyzing the quote, not just explaining it or summarizing it. And I'll go through all 4 of these things right now. So first, to find the high leverage or high impact part of that quote, if you're writing an essay, you want to find a variety of quotes that support your arguments. In a shorter piece like a timed writing, you want to find words or phrases within that given passage that are really powerful or deep. Again, that just sort of pop off that page, that make you say, oh wow, that's something really purposeful and really unique that this author did. And try to find quotes that make you as the writer think, okay, I can say a lot about this. I can write a couple sentences about this sentence or about these words. Then you have to identify how you're going to analyze it. So I would recommend making a list of 1 to 2 literary terms that you can identify within a quote. This is especially helpful for a timed writing because if you can tackle 2 literary devices, you can probably get a lot of analysis out of that. And this can be as simple if you're looking at a quote and you're like, I don't see any metaphors, I don't really know what's going on with any of those deeper literary devices. This can be as simple as analyzing powerful diction or a cheerful tone. Diction and tone are decent starting places. Just remember, you have to say something with diction. You can't just say diction. That just means words. So think about how this quote ties back to your argument or thesis. Remember, we just talked about thesis statements. Everything you do in a piece of writing always needs to point back to that thesis. If you find yourself not talking about your argument for an entire paragraph, you've probably lost your way in the writing. Always come back to your argument. The analysis and the argument should be the same thing. So always make a larger plan so that you're analyzing a variety of things. If I give you a quote that's a paragraph long, make sure that you're not just analyzing the first sentence and the second sentence. Go for variety so you really show that you understand the entire quote, or for a longer essay, the entire book, and that you've got a scope of understanding all of it instead of just parts of it. Okay, so once you've identified those literary devices, you say, okay, here's a metaphor. The author's using a metaphor to compare this person to another thing. Break that down. Once you've found a metaphor, a symbol, a creepy tone, whatever, start by taking kind of a step back and saying, well, what is a metaphor and what does it do? This brings you back to the idea of why an author would ever use a metaphor. It's one thing to say, oh, cool, a metaphor, but another thing to be able to say something about why Mark Twain would use a metaphor in this scene. For example, again, continuing with this metaphor example, these metaphors are used to compare 2 unlike things. I'm going to get real specific and give you an example here. So remembering that a metaphor is used to compare 2 unlike things for a purpose, say you've got a metaphor comparing a hero to a wolf. If a hero is compared to a wolf, the author's trying to say something about that man, the hero. Wolves, we know, are brave and fearless, but they also rely on their pack. They're not loners. Therefore, the author might be saying something about how a hero must be brave, but must also rely on the support and strength of others, the strength of his pack or her pack, to survive. You've just broken down a metaphor of a person being compared to a wolf. And the last thing is to always go back and make sure you're analyzing, not explaining. You'll see that in turnitin.com, I have a quick note that I drop on some of your pieces of writing, on some of your Raisin in the Sun writings, that says analyze, don't explain. And this is what I'm talking about. Be sure that your analysis can be described as close reading, that you're really unpacking the author's words. You're not just summarizing it. You're not just telling the reader something that they already know. You're really showing it to them. You're breaking that thing wide open. The more specific you can be, the less risk you will run of just explaining a quote or summarizing a quote. Here's an example that I pulled from To Kill a Mockingbird. I gave a similar presentation to my freshmen a couple weeks ago, so I'm just recycling that for you guys because I know you've all probably read this book. This is a very famous quote from To Kill a Mockingbird where Atticus says to Scout and Jem, "You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb inside of his skin and walk around in it." This is a really famous quote having to do with empathy and understanding other people by empathizing with them or understanding them. Here on the left, you can see this is just really explaining the quote. In this quote, Atticus explains to Scout that in order to understand others, she must experience what they experience. She must see from their point of view by looking through their eyes. Without learning that what someone else's life is like, you can't know what they're really going through. So from reading that, I can tell that you understand the quote, but you're not close reading it yet. You're not talking about the words the author used. You're not talking about how this has meaning and significance. Look at the example on the right. In this quote, Atticus explains to Scout that in order to understand someone, you must see from their point of view. He uses the metaphor, climb inside of his skin and walk around in it, to hammer home the point that this really involves immersing yourself in that person's life. Obviously, he doesn't actually want Scout to climb into someone's skin, but this exaggeration strengthens his point. He also uses the word never, which implies that before you're able to see from someone else's eyes, you will not reach a deeper understanding of them. It's likely that he knows many adults who have never reached this point in their own lives. So there you can see that the analysis is picking specific words and discussing how they're used and discussing what that implies about the larger meaning of this quote. All right, and that is it. That's really all I have for you in terms of a quick review on thesis statements and close reading. You guys can feel free to rewind this, go back, take a look at any other parts. I'll post just the presentation in the Schoology Locker as well in case you want to just click to a specific slide rather than rewatching this video. But hopefully this helps in preparing you for our timed writings and our larger essays to come, because the two most important things are having a strong thesis and doing some good close reading, and everything else really does flow from that.